welcome everybody. This is our third Campus Climate Action Speaker Series program on decarbonizing the campus for this academic year, that is. And so we've appreciated everyone's support and engagement on this. We did start to do these in person, and we got a lot of feedback that it would be better to actually have these virtually as we get more people to join us in our hybrid world. And that was excellent feedback. So thank you all for that direct feedback to us. So we have a great program set up for us today on what can MIT learn from Smith College's geothermal transition. And what we're going to do is I'll give a very brief introduction for those of you just joining us for the first time. And then we'll jump into our featured speaker with an introduction from Ellie McLean, our sustainability project manager, who's been overseeing the development of this series this year. So why don't we just jump right in? Thank you, Ellie. So again, for folks just joining us, we just want to remind you that about 109 years ago, MIT's energy era began with coal. And so we're in our fourth energy era. We shifted from coal to oil, to natural gas, to cogen, as you can see here, to advanced cogen, which is what is providing all of your electricity, steam, and chilled water today. And if you go to the next slide, we've got now two commitments as we look ahead. We're looking at accelerating impact in the next 5 years, less than 5 years now, with large-scale renewable energy projects. But what we're focused on today is the evolution of our district energy system over the next 20 years. And that's the feature and focus of decarbonizing our campus. And so we've been looking over the past couple of years, and particularly the past 18 months, on what does it mean to consider decarbonization with respect to the energy that we generate and the end use of our generation, with the inclusion of looking at chilled water, steam, electricity, and the flow of hot water across campus, which we'll hear a little bit more about today. So again, that's the background. We've had a robust process of engagement over many months. Unfortunately, our person, Vasa Mathis, who's not with us today, has done a remarkable job with support from Joe Higgins and team on managing this process, seeking input over this process. And it's actually been one of the areas that we've gotten many calls on from other universities around the country as to how we've set that up. So keep in mind, what we'll learn about today is that this has been the planning process. And as we're engaging our peers like Denise today, we're also really now interested in what's to come. What does it mean to create a robust implementation process with some of the same or new people looking ahead? So we really are excited for that part of the conversation. Go ahead, Ellie. And lastly, just to keep in mind, we've been looking at a range of technologies, many of which we're exploring through these decarbonization forums. And so today's focus is district geothermal. We recognize Smith is a very different college, but again, the focus is on the technologies, how it's working, how they did their test well, how it's functioning, how they shifted from planning to implementation. And we're so fortunate to have this wonderful working relationship over many, many years with Smith to hear from that. So please be prepared to think of questions you can ask, and whatever we can't answer today, we can always circle back, with Denise and team in the future. So I'm going to pass it over to Ellie to introduce Denise, and then over to Denise. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and especially to our featured speaker, Denise McKahn. She's a cross-disciplinary engineer who's studied environmental, mechanical, electrical, and chemical engineering through both research and formal coursework. She was hired as a faculty member at Smith College in the Department of Engineering in 2008, and she's a scholar, advocate, and a civil and environmental engineer. Denise has been a key collaborator on Smith's geothermal project, as Julie mentioned, across all Denise's roles, including as a faculty member, a former faculty director of the Center for Environmental, Ecological Design and Sustainability, and as the associate provost. She's dedicated to the development of renewably derived fuel and electricity generation technologies through the design, modeling, and control of dynamic and complex systems, and is particularly interested in both fuel cell electricity and electrolytic hydrogen production. Her recent work has explored modeling and experimental validation of mass and thermal dynamics in polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cells, as well as reactant pretreatment for active water and thermal management. She's currently serving as the Associate Provost at Smith, and in this role, she ensures a thriving academic program at Smith, aligning resources with the curricular and co-curricular mission of the college in a sustainable and equitable way. She manages the academic budget of the college, overseen by the provost, and chairs the Committee on Faculty Compensation and Development and many other responsibilities. I don't know how you do it all, Denise. And today she's going to talk to us about their geothermal transition. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Denise. Oh.
Denise, you're still muted.
We might have to unmute her,
There we
Rebecca.
go. I got you.
There you go. All right.
And you want to, oh yeah, the screen's there. All right, take it away.
Great. Thanks.
You guys all able to see my screen okay?
Yeah, if you just want to put it in presenter mode. There we go. Perfect.
There we go.
All set.
Almost smooth. So appreciate the context. Really excited to be here with you all today. As mentioned, there's been many different ways in which I've been engaged on this project. I've been focused, I would say, for almost the better part of 14 years on getting this system off the ground. And I want to set appropriate scale here. So I would say Smith is almost kind of like a mini version of MIT, if you will, but not quite in the same urban setting, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that as I go through the project. I'll give you a little bit of context for what we're doing here and where I see opportunity at MIT. Obviously, I have quite a context for the work that you all are doing, and admirable work. And I would say I really, really appreciate the efforts that your community has given toward helping us all reach carbon neutrality. So here at Smith, part of what we're doing, and just to set some quick context, we're 2 years into a 6-year project to completely transform our centralized heating and cooling systems. In doing that, that's also included many other cascading impacts. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Here you can kind of get a sense for the scale that we're talking in terms of the kind of infrastructure work that we're currently engaged in here at Smith. To start us off, I want to give you some context for where we have come as an institution. So similar to MIT, we had decentralized coal-based systems many years ago. So the college was founded in the 1870s until the World War II, where we installed our first centralized heating system. At that time, no cooling was added. We had coal-fired, decentralized, basically boilers and fireplaces. There were a number of ways in which we were distributing coal. One of the first projects we took on at Smith, because any good educational institution will help sort of think about the educational mission of the institution in alignment with sustainability. And we dug through the archives to do that work. So we actually had minutes, Board of Trustees minutes redacted from the time of leading into World War II, and recognized at that time when we decided to kick coal and invest in steam. We did that under the auspices of potential reductions in air quality and ability to more efficiently generate and distribute thermal energy. So many of the same drivers that we see today were actually at place even 70, 80 years ago. At that point, following World War II, we installed our centralized system. So timelines were actually not that far off. Right now, we've modified that system over time. So we have a natural gas supplied system. We have 2 boilers, 3 large boilers. They supply the majority of the heating during peak season. We have a cogen turbine with heat recovery and steam generation. That supplies about 1/3 of our peak heat and about 70% of our electricity. The other 30%, when I came to Smith, was supplied through grid electricity. Now that's supplied through one of the largest solar installs in New England, in Farmington, Maine. So that was a 5-institution solar PPA, power purchase agreement. So as we're starting to think about how do we shift to electricity, we're also tracking on solar. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Existing systems, to give you some sense of scope, we have about 104 buildings. There's actually more than that that are not included in our centralized system, about 3 million gross square feet. We have a boiler plant that's supplying about 81 of those buildings. We have a chiller plant that supplies 29 of those buildings. That changes every year. We add more and more and more buildings to chilled water over time. We have been. The pictures that you see on the bottom in this image, the one on the left is a boiler. The one in the middle was the one time I got to actually see the turbine. It was being maintained and they had the hood open. And I happened to have a group of students that you see on the right who are taking an advanced thermodynamics course with me. And I wanted to explain to them where the injectors actually injected fuel. So we took a nice picture of the turbine there. But that gives you some sense of the infrastructure at Smith. It's not that dissimilar from what you would see at most of the colleges and universities in New England. What changes is scale, right? How big they are and how much they're supplying. When Smith first took this work on, I would say from the period of about 2010 to 2016, in 2010, we were really facing some significant constraints in thinking about how we would imagine achieving carbon neutrality. And I'll talk a little bit about that history, but in 2007, we signed a climate commitment. We had no idea what we were going to do to achieve that, right? Like as many institutions, first is the commitment, then it's you figure out how to do it and bring in the engineers. So in 2010 was when we realized we needed to actually understand what we were consuming. And if we wanted to actually reduce carbon emissions, we had to address our carbon sources. And so we did what most institutions did at that time. We put our money in biofuels, if you will, and thought somehow that would be the savior. In institutions, I was just talking to somebody from Colby, Dartmouth, where you have ag programs, that you have biofuel stocks that are readily available, that are on campus, that are part of educational programs. That's a different scenario. For Smith College, that was not our condition. Similar to MIT, we were in a place where we did not have a readily available biofuel. So we realized by the time we got to 2016 that electrification and offsets was going to be the path forward for Smith. In doing that, we engaged in a decarbonization study. So that was really an opportunity to look at how do we shift from high exergy combustion-based technologies to low exergy renewable technologies that are more suitable for injection of renewable energy into energy infrastructure. We had not yet settled on geothermal. So there we were thinking, how could we do waste recovery off the cogen power plant? How could we think about solid oxide fuel cells for electricity generation and waste heat recovery? How can we think about solar thermal, right? But generally trying to look at low exergy, right? Low exergy fuel stocks was the key at that time. Recognizing we were trying to minimize cost, minimize offsets, carbon offsets, and really thinking about scalability. In thinking about our carbon emissions, I want to just give you some flavor. I'm sure MIT is probably quite similar. Just the magnitude will be a little bit different. Here, what you see is a plot. Just because I love plots, I can't not have a plot, despite the fact that I'm now a budget manager. On the x-axis, you see time. On the y-axis, you see total emissions and equivalent CO2. And this gives you a sense. So in 2004, we installed a cogen power plant. We started generating our own electricity using waste heat recovery. That resulted roughly in a 30% reduction of on-site carbon emissions. In 2010, we installed a very significant academic science research building on campus. What that then meant is it took us about another 7 years to effectively swallow that increased consumption. So by adding a huge academic building, we radically increased our carbon emissions. Through energy reductions, we were able to bring that back down. Then the pandemic hit. We started closing some of our buildings. We're a residential college. Students were not on campus. The majority of our students were not on campus. And now our carbon emissions are starting to tick back up. That will hopefully shift as we onboard geothermal. So this gives you a sense. And our fear here was that, we're effectively flat in carbon emissions. There's only so much we can do. Aside from turning all of our buildings off, we cannot continue to operate our buildings and continue to reduce carbon emissions beyond some point. And so that was really our sole focus, was how do we do that work through actual reductions of carbon emissions and not reduce the reliance on carbon offsets. To give you a quick sense, and I know I'm going to fly through this, I want to give us some time to ask questions. I know your community, I know you want to get under the hood, so I want to make sure that I can give you some time to do that. In terms of thinking about how do we electrify, right? Like what does that mean? This is more of a technology response. What does that mean to shift to geothermal? How does that electrify us? So we have our source, which will be renewable electricity. This is a picture of one of the sets. You can see a bunch of the solar arrays in Farmington, Maine that are a part of the energy infrastructure. This was effectively shifting an organic dairy farm, multi-generational organic dairy farm, into essentially energy farmers. And so we did a lot of work there to think about what are the land use implications? How do we think about that when we're shifting farmland into energy harvesting? So some very, very interesting questions there, especially for students as they're grappling with like, what are solutions? Are they really solutions? Are we opening up more problems? Really, really interesting questions there. The widget, if you will, that we use is a heat pump, and most of you probably have some context for a heat pump. So apologies for those who already know what I'm talking about. For people who might be new to this, a heat pump is essentially, just think of your window box AC unit that you might roll out into your office every summer because your building has no cooling. That some of you might have that case, or your house, right? If you think of a window box AC unit, it's effectively a heat pump, right? What you're doing is you're taking heat from one location, one reservoir, and moving it to another, right? Heat always goes in one direction. So nobody's figured out how to violate the second law of thermodynamics. Heat moves in one direction. And so how do you get heat from a cold thing like the ground, right, that's operating at maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit in New England, to the building, which is you're wanting to be at 70 degrees, usually heat doesn't go backwards. And so what we do is we have this thing in the middle, and it's refrigerant. So refrigerant is moving and circulating around in a loop. And what we do is we make that refrigerant really cold, and then we get heat to transfer to the cold stuff to heat it up. Then we take that more heated stuff and we compress it, we squish it. When we squish it, it gets really angry and energy state increases. So it ends up increasing in temperature. You're using electrical energy in that compressor to transfer energy into that working fluid. Then it's really high in temperature. Then you can exchange with something like your room. And so that's the kind of magic of a heat pump, is you're taking low grade energy, turning it into sort of high grade energy, and you have to do some work to do that. Very similar to a window box AC, except when you're heating, you just flip it the other direction. Then we've got to take that energy and distribute it across campus. So there in that picture under distribution, what you see is pipes that then get buried all over the campus to take that energy, that thermal energy from your heat pump, and distribute it to all your buildings. Then inside your building, you have things like fan coils. I have one right behind me, this big, ugly white box. Sometimes they can look a little more attractive. Those are fan coils, and that actually takes that heat and distributes it into a space. You can also use baseboard hot water. There's lots of ways you can distribute that within a building, and it's kind of building specific depending on the size of the building. So that gives you a sense of how are we taking all of these thermal loads, heating and cooling, from something like combustion or, you know, other technologies, fossil fuel-based technologies, and then shift it to electricity. One of the efficient ways we can do that is through heat pumps. Now what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about then how is Smith doing this. So what we looked at was all of the different kinds of buildings we have on our campus. Similar to MIT, we've got you know, academic buildings, administrative buildings, office only buildings, residential buildings, big buildings, small buildings, lots of different, very eclectic mix, spatially distributed across our campus. And part of what we were looking at is which ones are similar, which ones have what kinds of thermal load profiles, how do we think about doing this, who do we anchor first on our campus, how do we think about once we start making them angry, how do we then like fix it before they start complaining? So I'll talk a little bit about that too. But we started working on a master plan. The master plan was the time where we realized we want to be centralized. We don't know the degree to which we want to be centralized. And we don't know exactly how we want to spatially divide up the campus so that we can actually move forward. So we started a basically 3-year district energy master plan to figure out how we would map that process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did that work in order to get institutional buy-in. We also then thought about what are some of the ways in which working on one part of the campus will help us inform other parts of the campus so that we can learn from mistakes, learn from our ability to kind of imagine both in the construction phase, but also in operation, how we can have future improvements and kind of go fast enough that we can leverage cost reductions, but also not too fast that we make mistakes. So that's also something worth considering and tuning on your campus is how does one phase inform the next? What I want to do really quickly is, and this image got a little blurry because I made it really big, so I apologize for that, but on the left is the first district that we started working on. So if you look in this image, all of the, if you can see the colors, all of the colors that are in red, that are in the upper right corner of that map was our first district. The ones that are kind of a navy color that are the top left portion of that district is our second district. And then we have the third district, which is at the core of our campus, which we kind of divided into 2 key phases. And over the course of those 3 years, we kept changing our minds about which phase we would do first. Even this image is an example. The one that we picked first is not the one that's labeled phase 1 here. So we had to kind of really work through that over the course of 3 years to figure out how we would map that, particularly as we kept doing cost estimations. So be patient with yourselves. Take the time to get it right. The first phase is the one portion, which is on the other side of technically a federal highway, even though people are going 20 miles and 25 miles an hour. And that's mainly a residential loads. So that's where, you know, the majority of our students live on campus. It's kind of like Hogwarts. So that's where all the, you know, housing is on that side of the house. We put in a 250-ton heat pump with also water chiller. So we have heating and cooling, which is allowing us as an associate provost, I get excited about opportunities for summer programming. And we have a condensing boiler connected to that system. There, we ended up with 71 800-foot bores. So the geothermal wells, and you can see that on the map with those, there's like a patch of blue dots. That's where the geothermal well field went. And it's now a beautiful meadow. So we've now gone through the phase. This whole district is complete. It's in operation, has been in operation since the fall. We've had all sorts of hiccups trying to figure things out, mainly in the controls. I'm a controls engineer, so that's where the fun stuff is. And that's another area of work to really make sure that we get that right. So that's the first district in construction. The images you see are of one of the drill rigs in that well field drilling. And we had 3 going at a time that were moving around, drilling those. And then you see the piping that was laid moving into the buildings. So give you a sense of scale. Those are basically like, you know, plastic wall insulated piping. Nothing particularly fancy for those. The second phase in construction is residential. So that's the portion of our campus where it's what you would imagine as your centralized quad, if you would, at most institutions where, you know, the majority of our students are housed, the structures are larger, we have more deferred maintenance there, we have ADA accessibility issues. Once you go into a building, you have to figure out how to bring it to code, all sorts of fun stuff there. We ended up, this project is really fun because this is actually where we started. And I'll show you a picture of a student later who's now graduated, got her PhD and has just started her faculty position this year. And she's working in architectural engineering, but she did rough sizing for me to get a sense of like, do we want to centralize our campus or not? And one of the questions we considered was, could we just wall off the quad and have that be its own district? The answer was yes. Then we decided to go fully centralized, and then we flipped back again and said, you know, actually that student was right. And so I had to remind her of that as she started her faculty position, that now that she feels like teeny tiny from having been berated getting her PhD, that she did some great, amazing work and is really, really, really forward thinking. So this work really helped inform that. So when I talk about campus as classroom or living lab, that there were students involved in every single part of this process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Third phase is what we're also in construction right now. So second phase is further along. We're hoping to wrap that up within the next 6 months to a year. Third phase, we're in construction. We've already started trenching. We've done some work across roads. Our well field for this one moved all over the place. So here what you see is an image where we have what we call on the East Coast a river. I'm a West Coast person, so I maybe would call it a creek. But it's a small water body that moves through our campus. On one side is athletic fields. In that waterway are federally protected mussels. And then on the other side is our campus. So we did a lot of work to figure out how do we reduce environmental impact of bringing the pipes across and disturbances, bringing the pipes across the river to the central core of campus. We also consider public-private partnerships. So as you think about your urban setting, really thinking about where do you have fields available where you might have opportunities for public-private partnership is something worth considering. This particular part of the campus has about 315. We're now actually at 850-foot bores. Those are standard U tubes for anybody who pays attention to geothermal. Each district has its own heat pump power plant. In this particular district, we're actually leveraging our existing chiller plant and power plant spaces, which are in the very bottom of the campus, what you see in this image. What I want to talk about here is, I know what you're interested in is less about necessarily the details of what we did, but what did we learn from it? And so I really, really, really want to spend some time on that. The very first one that I always start with, and I saw that in the work that Julie presented for you, was in thinking about when you make a carbon commitment. For us, that was in 2007. I believe MIT was right around that same time as well. It's real, right? And if your institution has buy-in to that commitment, right, which I know at MIT you do, then you've got to make sure your institutional strategy is aligned to that. And much of the work that Julie was showing and her team really indicated that is, what are your governance structures? And so here what I'm showing you is a temporal map, just what we did in time. And then I'm going to flip that and tell you how we thought about that as an institution. In 2010, that's where the work really started, where we tried to figure out, what do we do? How are we actually going to achieve this? And how can our plan be less of what I call an urban planning plan, where you have some ideas, and how do we turn that, no offense there, and how do we turn that into a plan that's actionable, that actually gets us, that's like a goal-based and recommendation-based, but action-based plan. So that's what we were trying to do in 2010. And we realized pretty quickly, we were unsure how we were actually going to achieve it. Most of the institutions at that time were simply saying, we'll buy carbon offsets. Then we started our decarbonization study in 2016. That's when we realized we needed to kick steam and we needed to have some version of a centralized system. What precipitated that was complete renovation of the core of our campus, our library. It was a huge project. Mylin was involved in the design of that project. Her team was cornerstone in our campus, and they were going to completely sever it from the centralized system. I might have lost my mind. I said, that's kind of a bad idea. We need to have an energy plan. And that's what kicked this off, really, was really an understanding institutionally that we didn't have a plan and that we needed to make some action. Some external political things were happening. Our president then reaffirmed our commitment to carbon neutrality in 2017, saying we're still in to our Paris Climate Accord. We then continued into a study group on climate change. That work was our most instrumental work. That was where we brought in the trustees, we brought in students, faculty, staff, alums, in very intensive work, multiple working groups, connecting the work that we were doing for climate, not just to operations, but to financial investments, right? Our endowment, where that's invested, into academic programs, faculty scholarship opportunities, into the co-curricular activities? How are we reducing the cognitive dissonance between the living and learned, what we say we want in the world and how we're actually engaging on our campus, right? So we really thought deeply about those, set up working groups for each of that, and had a significant number of community stakeholders involved. That was about a 1.5-year process. I would say my recommendation there, if you haven't already done that, do that. And if you're going to do it, give it the time to do it right. Don't go too fast. And I know that the needs are urgent, but the risk of getting it wrong isn't worth it. We then moved into district energy working groups. So we started developing a more detailed energy master plan. In that work, that took about 2 to 3 years. That was the cost estimation phasing work where we're really moving into schematic design for some of the phases of the process. It was in 2022 that we had board approval. To get to board approval, that work started in earnest, really with the study group on climate change, and about 2 years before the board voted. I was holding panels directly with the board members, bringing experts from outside the institution, from Natural Resource Defense Council, from all over, to talk about the need for climate action. We were working on educating the board. I had students presenting to the board. These are undergraduate engineering students presenting to the board on what heat pumps are, what geothermal is, right? And we started with board members afraid that we were going to fry our fish, right? I'm not kidding. Like, we're going to fry the fish in the pond because we have geothermal next door, because they just didn't understand the technology. And rather than be dismissive, we had to educate. It's an opportunity. And I would say the board loves being, for us, our board of trustees members love being educated, and they love being educated by our students. And so that was really, really key. We talked to them about what's the risk of no action. That was all bringing experts. We have a faculty member who was actually in the Biden administration working on climate policy. So he talked about with the board, what happens if we don't do anything and Massachusetts passes a CO2 version of a tax or proxy tax. And so that was in earnest about a 6-month process. We had a unanimous vote on the approval of the largest infrastructure project in Smith's history. So I just can't overemphasize that. A unanimous vote on Smith's largest infrastructure investment ever. And that takes really diligent work. You can get there. Then we started transforming our camp energy systems. Construction is expected to be complete by the end of 2028. And we'll be well on our way to hitting carbon neutrality with by 2030. We're trying to reduce, and we'll end up having to use carbon offsets as a part of that, but we'll hopefully have reduced our carbon emissions by about somewhere between 80 or 90%, which is going to be fantastic. We're really excited about that. So I'm going to go through some of this a little bit more quickly. So in terms of governance and operational structures, they absolutely have to be in alignment. I think you're already on track in doing this. So make sure you're integrated with your finance team, board of trustees. For us, Committee on Sustainability is the infrastructure where we have students, faculty, and staff that engage in setting policy. So that's where we were able to put a social cost of carbon on our capital projects, things like that. We had our study group on climate change, which sat across that work, making sure the capital projects and operations and the power plant team are in alignment so that they can also think about workforce planning, what happens as we start to transition our energy infrastructure, and engaging the campus community. We have to explain the rationale for why this particular investment is critical for the success of the institution. The key piece of this that's often missing, and I know through Living Lab, you guys are thinking about this, is the link to the educational mission. If all of that is not aligned with your educational mission, you're always running against it, right? You're always the competing resource. And I say this in my role as the senior budget manager, right? Like, you're always at odds trying to rationalize your existence. You have to link it to the educational mission. And that is kind of what helps round that out. I'll talk a little bit about ways to do that. Really quickly, I want to give you some numbers. So the next thing that I would say, learn from the experience, is make a really good business case. I know you all are working on this, but this is one of the early examples. And here, this gives you a sense. So the scale of the investment is now about $250 million. And we expect to recover that by 2040, right around that time is where we have a break-even point. The most significant cost savings here are in operation and maintenance. It's a much simpler system and way less energy losses because you're operating at lower temperature. So lots of opportunity for lower cost, but also a lower carbon future. So if right now the social cost of carbon is not a part of your decision-making, figure out how to make it a part of your decision-making. So that's a big part of the work that we did and was directly connected to published scholarship of one of our faculty members. The next piece I wanted, because I know you might be interested, is then how did we pay for it? Because it was really expensive. So total project cost at the time when we did this, we thought it would be about 210 million. We've had construction escalation following the pandemic. Everyone's experiencing that. So we're now more around 250. We knew that would be over 6 years. We also now have, in theory, Inflation Reduction Act funding. That's been a kink for us. So we have an application in, we're terribly nervous. The 30-year cost of the existing system was about 340 million. 30-year cost projections were 279. So for most institutions that operate on a 4 or 5 year life cycle cost to guide decision-making, we had to do a lot of work to say, you know, we need to be thinking about that more expansively. This isn't light bulbs, right? These aren't LED light bulbs. And so you really have to do some work when you're talking about institutions that have been around for 100 years, right? It's not too hard to make that case. And we're early adopters as I see it. I had to do this work with hydrogen and fuel cells earlier in my career, right? To think about who are those early adopters. Here, institutions that can think about a different life cycle cost assessment are going to be the leaders. We were very fortunate following if there was anything positive to come out of the pandemic, it's that we got very cheap money. And we were lucky to be able to borrow 250 million at below 3%. And that's what's funded this project. So we've been very, very lucky to be able to leverage that and that we had buy-in from the trustees to move quickly on it. Real quick, additional business case factors that you should not rule out are things, obviously, reduce carbon emissions from direct fossil fuel consumption, scope 1 emissions. Also reduce water consumption for steam-based systems don't forget about that one, especially if your water is expensive. Improve local air quality is harder to put any measurements on. Opportunities for expanding summer programming because you have cooling now is definitely, or to decompress the academic calendar for sports and things like that. So think about what you're doing during the summer that you might be able to leverage with having cooling available. You have to cool your buildings because if you take heat out of the ground, you got to put it back, right? Otherwise, you're going to have a serious problem. So there's a lot of other factors that also weighed into how we stacked the total cost for these systems. I wanted to give you some flavor of a few challenges that we had. There's others, and you're welcome to come campus and visit. But one is, as we knew, was going to be trying to minimize the impact to the core business, right? We have students who we are educating, and that educational experience manifests in a whole slew of ways. And trying to make sure that we can keep operations going, not disrupt classes, not disrupt research labs, right? While we're in every single building on campus, it takes a lot of care and consideration in terms of how you manage that. I will say, kind of half jokingly, the nice thing is by the time you really start to annoy people, you're done and you're moving to a different building. And so also, like, it's worth it, right? But it is disruptive. And you want, especially with construction costs escalating, we actually have been moving quicker because the cost of delay is not worth it. If there's anybody here from facilities and operations teams, really start working on the culture of continuous improvement. That there will be things that go wrong and we will fix it. We know that. And that we have to continue to keep thinking about how do we iterate and make ourselves better and better and better at doing this, particularly as you're moving to different parts of the campus. So that's more like change management. There's some other things really quickly. You want to start small. You want to stay on the periphery of your campus. think about the places where you have the lowest risk, think about how you want to phase the implementation, leverage the opportunity when you're building new buildings to demonstrate and try out new technologies. I know MIT is already doing that. But what I want to do, I know, just because I know also that a big part of what you're doing at MIT is connected to live, and here I'm just calling it Living Lab. I can't use the word lab at Smith College. It's like a no starter. So here we call it Campus's Classroom, even though it's not a classroom. But it's really about core competencies. So when you're engaging students, how are you doing that with respect to learning outcomes? So much of the work I've been centered on, and I won't go through too much of it here, but much of the work I've been centered on is actually about the learning sciences. What do we know about how people learn from a science-based perspective? And then how do we incorporate that into the work that we're doing? And I want to give you just a couple of highlights on that. The first piece of advice I would give you, and I know that you're doing this, is mapping your institutional learning models. So a big part of the work I started doing 10 years ago was to look at how we're talking about learning on our campus. Here on my campus, the way we were talking about that was through inquiry-based learning. That's course-based research, tends to be in the natural sciences, where you have a question driving the process, a hypothesis, right? And the outcome might not be the product, it's the process, right? So that's your capstone kinds of experiences. Human-centered design is also a big conversation. We have a Stanford IDEO model for how we think about design and design processes. So stakeholder co-creation, community-based co-creation, framing the problems together, spending a lot of time in the problem definition, right? We also have a big active community, learning community here at Smith in what we call authentic problems, or kind of a service experiential learning model. I was on a fellowship in Kiel in England, and their service-based models were the way that they talk about the work that they're doing. And that was a really fun sort of shift. So how do you think about reflection, meaning, right? There in the context of a response to World War II, and how do we have like more ethical treatment? Kind of head, heart, hand is another way people have described that work. So find how your communities think about that, and then think about your living lab as that intersection of those things. And it will be, right? It always is. For us here at Smith, most of the work we realized was in paying attention to the connective tissue between the student experiences. We focus a lot on the containers, like they do a thesis, they take a class, right? But actually for Living Lab, where you hold the greatest asset is in the interstitial space. So who is the group of people that are holding that work? So that a student, in this case, this was a student of mine who was the one who redesigned the quad, which is why I use this example, but I have a lot of them, where the student comes in and is mad about the world, and then they do a summer internship and start asking questions and poking us, and some, well, okay, go find out more. And then they take a course and they start to learn and gain some skills. And then they take another summer internship, and or maybe go to, in this case, the student went to Princeton for our version of a study abroad, because it kind of is, and then came back, right? And so then how are we threading that? This student was on the committee on sustainability. She was part of the study group on, one of our student representatives on the study group for climate change. She was one of my students who presented to the board, right? How does that end up actually at the foundation of revolutionizing our energy infrastructure? We're training climate leaders. That's what we're doing, right? Geothermal at Smith arguably is going to have no impact on the world directly from carbon emission reductions, but it will through educating climate leaders. And that's where you do that linking. It's an incredibly powerful shift of perspective. And then how do you hold those questions the students ask in parallel with the actual work you're doing? And how do you have those inform each other? That's the most powerful part of the Living Lab model that you all are starting to really kind of move forward at MIT. This gives you a sense, so I want to talk real quickly about one project, and I know I have a couple colleagues here who have joined us from Micro-AeroPower, so hi out there. Part of the work that we're doing right now is actually using this building, which is completely off of our centralized system on the other side of the river by the athletic fields. So it's kind of fair game. It's sort of turned into my research lab. But how do we use that to demonstrate new technologies? So we started this work with Lily, the student I was telling you about on the left. And I've had a number of students, these are just a few of them, who then went on into grad programs, earning PhDs. year after year. The drill rig you see on the left was the first drill test well that we drilled. We installed a coaxial geothermal heat exchanger, added a fiber optic cable to measure distributed temperature down the vertical. We've been collecting a lot of data on the performance of that system, put in a geothermal heat pump. On the far right there, you can see the picture of my students actually doing that work, like with hard hats on. They loved it. And you can see me taping the fiber optic cable to the outside surface of the heat exchanger. That system's been in operation now for, I think, 3 years. So we have a pretty good data set on it. What we're doing now through a US DOE, Department of Energy SBIR grant, is installing thermal storage. So I'm working directly with Microera Power. They're leading this effort, developing novel thermal storage materials using phase change. And think of it as a thermal battery that can balance loads for heating and cooling. During the fall, what we're doing is focusing on storage of heat. During the spring, what we're focused on is storing cooling. And the work that they're doing, you can actually shift the temperature at which phase change occurs. And then we're moving the phase change material through valves to different parts of the system. So we can put it on the ground loop and downsize our geothermal well field, which has huge capital cost reductions. We could put it on the distribution side at a different temperature and actually start doing thermal demand response. So I've integrated a grid-based, what I would call a person who models grid penetration of renewable energy, to start thinking about thermal load profiles associated with demand response systems. We're working on this now, doing some of the thermal modeling work with Salas O'Brien, which is the team that is our energy consultants on our district energy system. We're hoping to actually install the tanks probably in about the next 2 months. So we're still on track. This will be one of the first off-site demonstration projects that the team engages in. And we're hoping that we move through to the next phase of the grant and consider maybe even wrapping this into the 3rd district at Smith. It won't save us any money, but it'll be a proof of concept to help guide decision-making on integration with thermal storage in other campuses. So really, really exciting project. This is a picture, an older picture of one of their test rigs on the right. Here on the left is really, for anybody who cares, thinking about ways that we integrate thermal storage. Here, that PCM is the phase change material at different temperatures that are valved and connected into supplying heating and cooling for the building. So some really, really fun stuff that we're going to be demoing in the next couple months. So keep a lookout for that. And with that, I want to go ahead and open up for questions.
That's great. Thank you oops. You hear me? Thank you so much, Denise. And thanks for being so transparent. And for everybody on the call, as Denise suggested, many of the folks that we're bringing where we're able to get the transparency are long-term connections that we've had between our institutions, where we get to just openly share with each other, because we know that we're all in this together and trying to figure out how to advance, in this case, decarbonizing our campuses, but really across the sustainability spectrum of work that we do. So thank you again, Denise. Listen, I'm going to start off with 2 quick questions for you. Just to kind of level set on some things to really get your insight. And then there's a more technical question. So we'll try to do some rapid fire here with our remaining, 9 minutes or so. So one question that we have that's emerged is really thinking about, I think you've alluded to this, where these partnerships come in, is that, as you leapfrog to one, to geothermal, you get to share your lessons learned, so that when it's our turn to now start to, do our test well and work on these things, we get to potentially leapfrog into the next level of technology. So one of the questions is, what technological advancements or innovations that you are aware of, or what you're keeping your eye on, that could enhance Smith's geothermal system in the future? And are there opportunities to further optimize efficiency and integrate new emerging technologies? And is your system designed for that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great idea. So the first, and that was a conversation we had with the board over and over and over. I think there's a natural temptation not to be on the bleeding edge, right? But the leading edge, and our board was not excited to throw money down the toilet. And so a big part of what we were trying to do was really that idea that we're shifting into a low exergy distribution system. And when I say low exergy, it's kind of, think of the quality of the energy. right?
Mhm.
When we shift to lower temperature, it allows us to have a lot more options for where we get that.
Uh-huh.
And so that was a really big game changer, is regardless of geothermal, the distribution, and we actually even got the board to say, okay, fine, if we're not gonna do geothermal, at least let us change the distribution, right? Because if we can move to
Yeah.
lower temperature, it gives us a lot more flexibility in the future for some pretend new clean energy technology that hasn't yet hit the market. At that time, thermal storage was not really on our radar in a substantive way. We did a lot of
Mhm.
work on thinking about ice storage for cooling, storage of liquid phase water just as an energy
Mhm.
buffer. It's the size and volumes required are absolutely prohibitive, and the
Okay.
cost required wasn't worthwhile. What we have now discovered is that when we're working with phase change materials, we have like an eighth of the stored volume required with those materials. And we can
Fascinating. Uh-huh.
have phase change shift to different temperatures. So we can change phase at low temperature, right? Or higher temperature, even as a transition material at really high temperature connected to phasing out of cogen systems. That's where I think we really have a lot of interesting flexibility over the
Mhm.
next few years. As those materials become more and more less demonstration project and more market ready, I
Mm.
think will rapidly change them in the next 5 years. I think it's going to be a real game changer for institutions that don't have the same financial resources.
Interesting. Well, let's stay in touch on all of that. Actually, I think you can stop sharing since we're at questions so we can see you. Maybe we'll figure out how to get you pinned in there as well. But thank you for that thorough response. So with that in mind, has the transition to geothermal had a measurable impact on energy costs for Smith College? And what have some of the financial benefits or trade-offs been? And I'm sure that's a question that, again, we get to learn from, but so do many other organizations. And thank you for walking through how you finance it as well. That was really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Hopefully I can give you enough flavor to speak to that.
Yeah,
When
sure.
we talk about cost savings, operational savings are huge, especially when you run fire crew and have fire crew that can maintain your cogen systems, right? So that's a big cost savings as we think about operation and maintenance. Steam is really, if anybody's had to deal with maintenance of steam systems, it's a significant amount of work. You have high temperature gas phase materials, two-phase flow, where you're looking at liquids and steam and saturated steam. And so it's, shifting into liquid-based lower temperature distribution,
Hmm.
significant maintenance savings. In addition to that, having something where we have more reliable pricing options. So for our PPA,
Hmm.
where we have
Hmm.
predictable prices, less
Hmm.
volatile prices, it helps our finance team with
Hmm.
multi-year budget forecasting,
Okay.
particularly as other uncertainty is increasing, right?
Yeah.
So off
Right.
of natural gas fluctuations and having more reliable electricity purchase opportunities was huge.
Right. Yeah, we're all navigating that right now, right?
Yeah.
Um, all right, I'm going to shift to a couple of more specific questions, but thank you for those responses. One is does your system and um, does does your system send refrigerant through pipes, or do you heat cool a water glycol solution or something else that is sent through the pipes? And it says, if the first, what is your refrigerant leak rate and what refrigerant are you using? That's a very
That's,
specific question. I'm going to nod as if I can follow your response. But
yeah,
I think to the person who proposed this, listen carefully.
I
Go
love the
ahead.
question. Thank you for it. It's my heart saying. I would say
That's
we have
good.
lots of pipes. We have all those things. So water glycol is what we circulate in the ground loop. So water glycol, or in some cases just water, depending on your situation. That's what we're circulating in the ground loop in one set of pipes. In the heat pump, wherever the heat pump is stored above ground in a building, inside the heat pump is where we circulate refrigerant. So that's a second loop. Refrigerant, I don't know the exact refrigerant we're using. I know we're in the middle of phasing out one kind of refrigerant It's my understanding that we're not using that refrigerant, but if somebody wants to know, I can connect you. I don't know which particular refrigerant they ended up settling on because there was some active conversation about that. But you do have refrigerant circulating in the heat pump. There's no way to avoid that. You need a material that can go from liquid to gas at really low temperature. And then in the distribution system to the buildings, that's all liquid water. So then we go at between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, we're above that, 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid phase
Okay.
water distributed to the buildings. And then within the buildings, we have liquid water and air that we circulate to actually then heat the spaces.
Excellent. Great response. All right, we've got just 2 more minutes. We're going to ask a very quick question, and well, they're both quick questions, and you can just refer us. We've got a wonderful note here from a student saying this was super cool to hear about all the ways you incorporate students in the process. And again, Denise, you and I've been in this for a long time. We have kind of students come and go off campus, and the challenge is trying to sustain those engagements when things have been answered along the way, right? How do you then re-engage the next level of students? So I just want to say you and I understanding those phases along the way, she says she would love to hear more about ways that undergraduates were involved and any intersection between learning and contributing and barriers you had to overcome in the process. And having known you and your work for a long time, I know this is something you and I've talked about this over the years around the challenges of test bed. So any quick thoughts on that? And the last one is just an IRA question around what your credit is, what the IRA credit value is that you may or may not get. But go ahead on the students and then
Great
we'll wrap
questions,
up.
and I'll move through those. I'll move through this because I know everybody also wants to get out.
Yeah.
So we're engaging with students I'm a faculty member at heart, right? That is my
Right.
habit. And so I can't tell you how many times I can answer the same question. I've had groups over and over and over keep calculating the first law of efficiency of our turbine, and like it never gets old. And so I think those are the places where what we're really trying to do is focus on the student interest. Where do the students, where are their questions? What are they angry about? And then how do we turn that into change? And so
Yep.
it's student-led. Most of the work we're doing is student-led, and my job is to do the matchmaking and figure out how do I take those questions and those interests and
Yep.
align institutional problems, and then uncover the underbelly of the institution to make
Yep.
change. But I agree, Julie, it's really, it's hard work. You have to keep doing it. You have to handhold. Each project that ends from a student needs handles, so the next student can pick it up and move it the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it
Yep.
goes off the rail and the handles bust off, you sort of set that aside maybe, and come up with a new one. So
Yeah.
that's part of the work that we have to do to hold that kind of space.
Yeah. That's
For
great.
the IRA, for the Inflation Reduction Act, we had, it's about $45 million of the total project we were expecting to get back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
MIT is facing about that and indirect cost on federally sponsored grants. So we're in the same. And I think we're forge a path forward. We're not yet sure we'll get that funding. If we don't, I think if we don't, it'll actually precipitate a much faster conversation with phase change materials and thermal storage, which is not a bad thing. So if there's any silver lining in there, it might actually get us to move more quickly to think about solutions relating to thermal storage, that, where we can actually think about that in the total life cycle cost.
That's great. Great answers. Yeah. Well, let's hope it's not, not lost yet. Let's just hope that there's just some pauses and hiccups in the system. I know we have our person from DC is online, so I don't know what he's thinking about that right now, but let's go, Phil and team. Let's get that money for our friends. Sorry, Phil. Anyway, thank you so much. Great responses on the students as well. I think to your point, we'll continue to work with ours, and I really like what you were saying in terms of continue to make the same challenge, available and interested, and engage regardless of whether or not it's been answered. Because these are things. This is how we train our students. We have to continue to engage with those same questions over and over again as a way that we learn. So really appreciate that as well. Well, thank you so much. Please, Denise, we will be having another one of these. on March 31st. We're purposely making these virtual so that our friends and our colleagues from our DC office and other parts of and on our hybrid world can join us. You're welcome to join if this is something that you're interested in as well, and you and your team. So we'll make sure you get the link. We've got Jacopo joining us on March 31st from 12 to 1. We'll send that out to everybody, and thank you again. And we look forward to further engagement with all of you. So thanks, team, also for making this happen. Bye, everybody.
Denise, take care, everybody.